another lesson with Nikola. It's really been amazing so far. We've had 2 sessions. This is our 3rd and final session before Nikola's match tomorrow with GM Anna Muzychuk. It's going to be an adoption match, and I'm helping Nikola stave off adoption. I think the first 2 sessions went great. Nikola, thanks again so much for doing this. It's been a pleasure. How do you feel on the evening before the match?
I feel like a proverbial snowflake before its flight into hell, to be honest with you. But hey, Tommy Shelby, thank you, my dear friend. It's very good to see you here. Truth be told, insert your favorite cliche here. I fully intend to die with my boots on, and I fully intend to go down swinging, and we'll see what happens. This is one of those situations in which nobody gives me any chance, so I have nothing to lose.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I have done everything I could to improve my chances to the extent possible. So I'll go there with my mind open, and let me put it this way: if Beyond Bleeder Chuck Wepner could knock down Muhammad Ali, and by the standards of this match, Chuck Wepner would have won that fight. So we'll see what happens.
Fair enough. I think, yeah, you've definitely got a shot. And hopefully today's session will also help you, as you say, die with your boots on or live with your boots on. So we talked a little bit before the stream, just to update our respective chats. What we were thinking of doing, we concentrated mostly on openings in the first 2 days. And today we were thinking of doing some end games. Nikola, you told me that you wanted a little bit of training, particularly in Rook End Games and some of the skills that are necessary to succeed in them. So I was thinking of starting with a warm-up problem or 2, and then transitioning into end games and making that the focus of today's session. How does that sound?
Sounds like a plan. And just a big shout out to Goran Zaric. Thank you for joining me tonight. Yep, fantastic. I'm ready.
Let's begin with one sort of warm-up problem from the recent online Olympiad. And it's kind of nice. And it'll sort of awaken your tactical mind, and then we'll transition to end games. So this position occurred in one of the games. It is white to move. It is white to move in this position. And, clearly you're trying to sort of win in the fastest way possible. Okay,
this position looks vaguely familiar, but not wholly familiar. Let me think for a second. Okay, let's see something. Obviously the H file is the motive. All right, so it looks like if we play Rook H1, Rook H8, and doesn't seem that we have much.
Exactly. So we have sort of a narrow window of opportunity here.
And I think to take advantage of narrow window of opportunity is to see if we actually have a mate after we sacrifice on H6.
Right. So queen takes H6, king takes H6. This is the critical position.
All right, very good. Okay. And Rook H1 and Rook G7 is obviously Rook H7 is mate.
Right.
So king has to go to G5, and then do we give this? We have this check on. If we give a check on F4, and then queen goes to. Now first, black can take, and the question here is, let's assume, can we mate the king here?
What does your intuition say?
My intuition is not, no.
Yeah, the problem is, well, there's 2 problems. First of all, the king is deceptively hard to hunt down in an open board. People think that king hunts are easy. King hunts are among the hardest skill in chess to master. And second of all, you run out of firepower here. The king has access to so many different squares. And because it is the open board, that actually helps black, not white. So that doesn't quite work. But the key here is not to abandon the idea.
Yeah.
But to try to enhance it.
Okay. So the question here is, can we play f4 first?
Okay. So you want to go f4 first to take away the g5 square.
Yes.
Well, you're attacking the bishop, so let's test the case with bishop takes a1 first.
Okay, then the sacrifice on h6 is winning.
Right, rook h1. Now the key is the king has no access to the g5 square. It has to drop back.
And that's mate.
And white delivers this very nice checkmate. That's exactly right. It is nominally more resilient for black, I suppose, to go rook h8, but now you win the bishop, and of course the game is over. You're up a piece. Very nice. Yeah. So this is sort of one of my favorite themes within the tactical realm, which is the notion that you see the correct idea very quickly, and then a lot of people sort of abandon it. But if you stick with it and you try to find ways to improve upon an initial concept, you'll often succeed. And people often forget that concept.
Yep.
So nicely done. And without further ado, let's transition on to Rook End Games. And of course, this is a vast topic, which I could talk about for years, essentially. You could talk about for decades. It has been talked about.
Yeah, no, I was looking at, I have quite a lot of endgame books, and, I think there is a Averbach's collection, and that book on dedicated, just I think it's volume 5, is kind of, few hundred pages just on Rook End Games. So
right. Well, the thing is, so Averbach, what Nikola is referring to is the collection of endgame manuals by Russian Grandmaster Yuri Averbach, who I think is currently the oldest living Grandmaster.
Yes.
And that was sort of the standard go-to book for Russians and Soviet players to study the endgame, which of course is a very extensive advertisement for it. So now everybody wants to read it. Now, the problem with these books, though, including Gorecki's endgame manual, is, as you said, Nikola, it has hundreds of pages of positions. You read through it. Even if you force yourself, at the end, you look back and you're like, well, what exactly did I learn? You're swimming in all these positions, and it's not exactly clear how to approach this vast topic. So I'll try to sort of approach Rook End Games from a conceptual standpoint. We won't be able to talk about everything, so I'll try to encapsulate some of the most important topics that you have to know. And we'll do that through the lens of a couple of interesting positions.
Yeah, and just an illustration, my earliest endgame manual was Rubin Fine. And we were talking Rubin Fine, that's a book that was, I think, written in 1941, and that was actually a standard endgame manual in like 70s, until about 70s. So, yeah, I'm showing my age here, guys. So, anyway. Hey, and thank you, Sepper, for joining us, and Martingale 1248. So, yeah, that's ancient.
That's really interesting. Now, before I jump in, one book that I can actually recommend firsthand that presents important endgames in a accessible and relatively readable manner is 100 Endgames You Must Know by Spanish GM Jesus de la Villa. I'm actually holding in my hands right now. There is also a chessable version.
Yeah,
I can recommend that.
I actually have both, and it's a great book.
Right. Fantastic analysis, and again, very digestible. But let's delve into a couple of important concepts, and let me paste in the first position.
Okay.
And this position is taken from one of my games against Grandmaster Jan Elvest, originally from Estonia.
Okay.
And for many years, one of the top players in the US after he immigrated. And I'm playing white here, so clearly I'm trying to make a draw. And the concept that I want to discuss through the lens of this problem, through the lens of this game, is perhaps the foundational notion of Rook End Games, which is that in any position, you have to kind of automatically evaluate what happens if you transition to a pawn endgame.
Yep.
And that has to happen essentially in any endgame which has one piece for each side. So bishop endgames, queen endgames, you have to keep in mind the possibility of liquidation into a pawn endgame, and you have to be able to evaluate said liquidation because that often dictates how you play.
Yep.
So clearly here I'm trying to make a draw. Black is up a pawn. He's cutting off my king from the F file. So it should be a draw because there's very limited pieces on the board, but clearly work has to be done. So the question is, how did I approach the question of making a draw here? What comes to your mind here?
Okay, so I wouldn't want, first thing that comes to my mind is I really wouldn't like to transpose this into a pawn endgame, because if we were to remove rooks, it's very likely that this is a one endgame for black.
Right. That's exactly right. So barring any sort of miracle, if we simply remove the rooks from the board, this passed pawn is probably going to guarantee black a win. Okay.
Yeah. Second is, if I remember I don't want to push the G pawn too far up. Hey Hedgehog, thank you for the sub. It's been 6 months, my friend. Thank you. I probably don't want to push the G pawn too far because it's kind of the safest where it is now. It's very difficult to attack. All right, so the question here is, what is the plan of play? All right, so let me think for a second. And this is exactly the type of endgame that I tend to needlessly lose.
Right, exactly. And everybody, I mean, these are among the hardest endgames to master because so many different skills are really required in order to play them with any level of decency. And even then, mistakes are so common in Rook End Games, they're inevitable.
Yeah. Okay, so let me think for a second. I think we should try. I mean, the black rook is already positioned in what I think is reasonably optimal position. So we kind of need to prevent black from bringing its king up.
Okay.
Rook f8 fails to king e5.
Okay. And once again, as you said, taking the rook here is very unlikely to succeed because this type of position is going to be winning for black. But it's very important, and this is one of the things I think perhaps some endgame authors don't make very clear. You want to start by putting on sort of your concrete hat. Like you want to try to make, if you're trying to make a draw, you want to try to make it by force first and foremost. And only if you cannot find a forceful way to play, then you sort of transition to the planning stage. You say, okay, well, I can't make the draw by force. I'm going to have to come up with a plan. But don't abandon this line too soon. Think about this position for a second. What change has occurred?
Well, this is actually Sepper posted one thing in chat that's actually a really good idea, which is you can play rook g8 in this position.
Okay, so you're attacking the pawn on g5.
Yes.
It appears that black has several ways to defend it, but the reality is all of them except one fail immediately. One of them is to go rook f5.
Yep. And that fails immediately to g4.
Correct. The other is rook, and the rook has to go and you take the pawn.
And same applies to rook g4. Right, because then king f3, and then we can repeat the position, or we can,
Right, exactly. So black has to repeat. Third method is to go g4.
Yeah.
And this, again, is not a very serious winning attempt. What does white do here?
What white can do here is white can just put the rook on a8, and then that there is a check on a5. Okay.
So you're abandoning the sort of search for concrete moves a little bit too quickly. Look carefully at the relationship between black's pieces.
I can do rook g5, and that actually probably wins the pawn immediately.
Exactly, because the rook has to block and you take the pawn.
Yeah.
So you want to save yourself as much work as possible. Now this leaves only one move, king f5.
Yes.
And once again, the question before white is, well, what do you do now?
Well, we do not want the black king to go to g4, right? Or do we?
Right, that's the question, right?
Yeah. And how?
So what's the first move we have to consider?
Well, I think targeting black pawns is rook f8, king g4 serves to black's advantage.
Okay, but let's unpack that for a second, because so I think one thing that you're doing, and it's not like I don't do it, everybody does it, is sort of overgeneralizing. Black makes something that resembles progress, but you have to look at the position first and foremost from a very concrete standpoint, and that means looking at all of the moves. Well, rook e8 is one move, but what other move do you have to consider for at least 1 second?
Okay.
Because it might draw immediately.
Okay. does exchanging the rooks.
Right. So if there even is an exchange, you have to give it at least a couple seconds of attention, because you might find that all of a sudden the circumstances have changed and, well, now you can draw or you can win a lot easier. So what happens here?
Okay, I can play king a4.
Right. And that's the key. The king now has opposition. What if black goes king g3?
Well, we need, if we play, we're playing king e5 and
correct,
and we have drawn.
King takes g2. Which pawn do you well?
Well,
not very difficult question.
That's an obvious question.
Clearly, you take the e6 pawn. Yeah, that's
okay.
So that's it. Black cannot make progress if he goes to g5 again, king e5, and the game is drawn. So as circumstances have indeed changed, the king is now misplaced. And, this was a lucky sort of set of circumstances. And I'm not saying that you should always trade rooks when you have a rook end game, but what you should always do is first look at all of the checks. Checks are crucial tools in a rook end game. That might sound like a very general piece of advice, but it's actually incredibly robust. In many positions, a check actually does the trick, whereas other moves don't. And the second thing is, whenever there's a rook exchange on the table, yes, you want to understand conceptually, is a rook trade likely to work, but then you also want to evaluate every concrete instance of a rook trade being possible.
Yeah, no. Part of my problem with rook end games is that usually when it's an end game, I have like 10 seconds of the clock, and I'm not exactly the quickest chess thinker in the history of universe. So that's that's part of the problem.
It's all good. It's all good. No, that's completely understandable, and that's a problem that occurs quite often, actually.
Okay.
Where you reach end games in time pressure. So totally understandable. Okay, so let's move on with the following position. Just give me one moment to choose exactly which one I want to show you.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah. So it's probably this one. Yeah, it's this one. Let me copy the position now.
Okay.
And paste it in. So a keen knowledge of theoretical endgames is required in order to play rook endgames well. So, and the reason that is because you want to know at which endgames you can transition to and which endgames you can't transition to. That's also known as target positions. You want to be able to set the target position accurately so that you know what you're aiming for. And we'll get some practice in that with this position where it's black to play. Again, it is clear that black is trying to make the draw, and white is the one pushing for a win. So how do we go about doing that?
This is black to move?
Black to move. And I'll flip the board.
Okay.
And I'm just going to pop my my air conditioning, so I'll be back in 5 seconds.
No worries. Okay.
All right. Good.
Okay, so I'll wait for Daniel to come back.
Yep, I'm listening. I'm ready.
I think the black realistically has only one chance of drawing this position, and it is to play f6.
Okay, interesting thought. So f6 forces e takes f6.
Okay, and then we're gonna play king f7.
All right, so I'm gonna give you a check on e7.
I'm gonna play king f8.
Right, and we get a very interesting position. So white actually has 2 extra pawns right in the FL. Most of the time when you've got 2 extra pawns in any endgame, that should be winning. But there are exceptions. Thank you, Toxic Chess Player, for the sub. So let's say I shift the rook back to b7. How does black go about trying to defend this position?
I'm gonna play rook a1 to try to give the checks from the first rank.
Very good. So as a side note, a lot of people might be familiar with a Philidor position where you basically, that's also called the 6th rank defense. You keep the rook on the 6th rank, and the moment that white's pawn shifts to the 6th rank, you come to the 1st rank and start delivering checks from the back. But what some people might not realize is that the Philidor defense actually applies even if white has 2 pawns on the 5th rank and the 6th rank, because that doesn't add any winning chances to white's position. In fact, the one thing that white can try. So first of all, just to kind of demonstrate, what if white goes f7? Because this is actually perhaps the trickiest move, and it requires some precision.
Yeah, we play king g7.
Okay. So that should do the trick. You could also go rook a6. That also does the trick. And the idea of rook a6 would be that if white ever plays f6 here, you have a very elegant drawing idea that you have to kind of know because it looks like it might lose. Can you spot it? And then we'll come back to rook a1, which also draws.
Yeah, we're talking about rook f6, right?
Exactly. Now, white can try to go rook b8 check, very tricky move. Okay. And here black has to maintain precision.
And here we have to play... Hey, Nate the Great, thank you for the follow. And thank you, Chazdo, for joining us. Here I think we need to play king g7, right?
That is correct.
Yeah.
And if I give you a check on g8, you take the pawn. And despite the fact that the king is sort of awkwardly placed, black is able to make the draw and eliminate the final pawn. It's crucial not to take the pawn because then you go rook b7 check and white wins the rook.
Yeah.
So these kinds of tricks exist all over the place, but you went king g7 immediately, which also certainly does the trick. You're inducing f6, and now you come back to f8, and now you, of course, have those back rank checks.
Yeah.
Last thing, if I try to go rook b4, how do we handle this situation?
Well, the pawn ending is also drawn.
Yes, that's correct, and that's I like your confidence. So how do you draw it exactly?
Well, the white doesn't have a tempo because tempo with an f5 pawn results in the stalemate.
That's exactly right. So you could actually go either king f7 or the most classy way to draw is to go king g8 and to wait for white to go king g5 and then you go king f7. But yes, you can also go king f7. And as Nikola points out, if we go to sort of the critical position, if white's pawn were on f4, he would now be able to play f5. That is why the concept of tempi is so important in pawn end games. But here he doesn't have that move. And if he goes f6, it's a stalemate. So you're exactly right. The move f6 is actually the only clean draw. There's other ways to draw. Black and just move his rook perhaps to a1. But this gives white a lot of winning chances after f6. This is where it gets very tricky.
Yeah.
So what you want to realize is that even in these seemingly uneventful positions, you want to always be looking for tactics, basically, for lack of a better word. And tactics, endgame tactics, is what can allow you to make sense of an outwardly complicated position. You have to sort of zero in on the important features of the position, and that can allow you to sort of save a lot of work. Let's practice that through a simple position, but one that really illustrates the notion that you have to be looking for specifics and for tactics in the endgame. So it's black to move here. Perhaps you can tell me who do you think is trying to win, and then find a path for black.
Okay. Well, black has this very far advanced pawn on c2. All right, and you know, were it not for the rook on the e4, black would already be winning.
Right, through rook d1 check.
Yeah, so rook d1, rook e1, and then we can take on e1 and play rook d8.
Very nice. Very simple, but good. And rook d1 is coming. Yeah. So could you start with the move rook d8? Would that be the same thing?
Good question.
Right. And actually a trickier question than it might appear to be. So the question is this as good, and does this win?
Good, actually. Let me see if I know the answer to that question. Hold on. Okay, we cannot. Yeah, Sepper is saying, can we? Well, if Sepper is saying in chat that we can play king f2 or king f1.
Right. So one of these moves is a lot more resilient than the other.
Yep.
And
let's find out which one. let's see why. Hold on. This is trickier than it looks, actually.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, and that's why what a lot of people don't realize about endgames is that they contain so many tricks and so many tactics with seemingly very few pieces left on the board.
Okay. If I play king f2, there is a check on d2, and then what do I do? I can go back to f1.
Okay.
And then there is a threat on taking on e1, but then I can
take with a king.
Take with a king, and then I can.
Oh, wait a minute! The king has gone to the first rank, which means which rook does black have to take the rook on e1?
No, it doesn't.
You can take the rook on c1, right? Yeah, and how can you follow up?
Then rook d1 wins immediately.
Correct. That's absolutely right.
So,
but there is actually a really cool. Well, there is a subtlety here.
Yeah. So basically, rook f1 loses. No, rook f1. Sorry, king f1 has the same problem because.
Yes, exactly. So king f1 here, you take and you go rook d1 check.
Yeah. So that loses immediately. King f2, rook d2.
This is the critical position.
And that's the critical position. What do we do? Okay. Well, we play. If we play, what do we play here? We can play. If we play king e3, just as an example, then what does black play? Okay, if he moves the rook from the d file, I can actually take on d1 twice, and that's perfectly
right.
fine
If he takes the pawn, you just take. But in these situations with a lot going on, you want to sort of start with all the captures. So like get a foothold on the position by looking at rook takes c1 and rook takes c1. What can you tell me about both of these moves?
The problem in this position is that I have rook e1, rook e1, rook e1, rook d1, and then I don't have an answer. So I need to play king f3 so I can give the check on e8 and play a rook c8.
So that's not quite right. Here's the problem. If you go king f3, I take on e1, I go rook d1, and I'm threatening promotion, and this check is not going to help.
Yeah.
But you're rushing to conclusions a little bit in this position. After king e3, rook e1, look very carefully at this position.
I can take king I can take king d2.
And actually, white is winning.
Yeah.
White is winning because he has the outside passer. All of a sudden, the pawn is not promoting. And the cool thing is that if you play rook takes c1, there is no symmetry in this position. If you take on d2 now, I take on e1 and I promote. But what do you do now?
Now I take on c1.
Now you take on c1. And obviously, again, the situation is not symmetrical because the rook is now stopping the pawn. And if rook d1, rook takes c2, white is in completely fine shape. He's got that passed pawn. So amazingly, the move rook d8, it still wins if black is super accurate, but it requires him to realize that he's got to play rook d6 here and start threatening side checks. And the situation gets very complicated. It's actually not a simple win anymore. So this kind of precision is requisite in order to play these rook end games very well. And you can see how big of a role calculation actually plays.
Yes. Yep.
And part of it should not be overthought. Part of rook end game mastery is just good, sharp calculation, considering all of the candidate moves, not taking anything for granted or making any false assumptions. So now that we have, I've tortured you with some calculation, let's take a look at some sort of classical games, which feature really cool plans. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of conceptual mastery.
Okay. So before we go, so this is basically one for black, but he needs to play rook d6.
Exactly. Well, so rook f8, king f2, rook d2, check king e3. He has to play rook d6. And at this point, it's not quite as one. Or actually, I think rook d5 is the move. And basically, the idea is you go rook f5 check, and you completely transition to a different plan. You go rook d2 check.
Gotcha.
And then you basically double on the f file. And the situation gets very complicated. White has defensive chances here.
Okay.
So this is certainly not the best.
Okay. Thank you. All right, understood. Okay.
Yeah.
So just a very quick shout out to Streeter28, CPK, my dear friend. Thank you for the raid with the party on 10. Raiders, I'm preparing for a match against Grandmaster Anna Muzychuk tomorrow. That's an adoption match, and this is my preparation lesson with Danya. So thank you for joining us. You're more than welcome. All right.
So let's talk about one very important theoretical endgame, and we will use that as a segue to some more open-ended kind of classical positions, and I think that's also going to be a lot of fun.
Okay.
So this endgame is, the reason I'm showing you, I've chosen this endgame and not any others, is because it's very often overlooked in books and when people talk about knowing important rook endgames. Not everybody realizes that this is even a thing. And this thing is what I think is often called the alternate Philidor defense, or the alternate drawing method in a situation where you have a rook against a rook and a pawn. So let me show you what this looks like. Now, this alternate method is necessary when you get a situation, broadly speaking, where you cannot put into effect the Philidor defense or the sixth rank defense. So here you're laying the white pieces.
I actually, Daniel, defended this against Grandmaster Gatakomsky as white.
Mm-hmm.
And I managed to draw it.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So do you want to try to reproduce the defensive method?
Yeah, I basically swindled it by a hook and a crook. And I remember that mercifully I had like 15 minutes on the clock and like a 30-second increment. But basically the defensive method is to go to the short side.
Right. So what move do you start with specifically?
Okay.
Because this first move is actually a crucial element of the drawing strategy.
Yes, I must not be allowed to switch to the long side. So in other words, if I allow black to give me a check and force my king on e2, I'm lost, because I cannot give side checks. So I need to push the black king to f3 and then play king g1.
So that method exists and this draws. But I will put it this way. There is a much simpler drawing method. And this short side, long side logic is true, but it's also very misleading, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it.
Okay.
And let me show you what that alternate draw looks like. I think you'll see that it's actually very straightforward. You'll never forget it. Now, before we talk about that, just a quick note, why can't white go rook b3 and orchestrate the Philidor position? Well, because black plays f3 and white is simply too late. He can't go to b8 because of the checkmate. Yeah. And if he goes to b1, well, here black goes rook h2 and he wins easily. Passive defense is never the answer in these positions. If you have to go back to b1, it's usually a very bad sign. So you go rook f7. And the idea is you're not stopping the move rook a1. Thank you, Goat Mama, for the sub. But you are stopping the follow-up f3.
Okay.
And in fact, here, black has literally nothing that he can do other than to repeat moves with rook a2 because there's nothing he can do. If he goes rook h1, then you go rook g7 check, and the draw is immediate. Rook h7, you take the rook, and you win the pawn. So realistically, black's only winning attempt here really is because otherwise, if he shifts the rook around, you just shuffle between f8 and f7. So he has to try rook to h2. Well, that's one of the attempts. The other one is to go king f3. Rook h2 doesn't do much because what I wanted to show is that the same thing exists on the other side. There is symmetry here. Again, black cannot make any progress. And the short side, long side considerations don't matter as much here. Now, the move that you have to actually know is king f3. And here, you're absolutely right. You have to go to the short side. What does that entail?
I basically need to play king g1.
Exactly. You do not go king e1 as many players have done. You go king g1. And the idea, as you correctly pointed out, is the king goes to the short side. It doesn't need that much space. The rook does need a lot of space, a lot of rope, in order to be able to give the side checks without black's king being able to approach the rook without dropping the pawn. So what does this actually look like? Black's main attempt is to go rook f1. If he goes king e3, this is essentially backwards progress. And what does white do here?
King g2.
Correct. So let me try rook f1 in order when I move the king to have this pawn defended. Now we continue the short side, long side strategy with what move?
I think we'd play rook e7 first, and then we put rook on a7.
So actually, we go rook a7 immediately.
Okay, yeah, my bad.
You could go rook e7. This also works, but again, the sort of purest way to draw is to go rook a7. And if you go king f2, white just starts delivering side checks ad nauseum. And if black goes rook e1 to try to cover these checks with his rook, well, then he's removed his rook from the f file, and you can simply come back to f7. Yep. There is no other way that black can make progress.
Yep.
And again, if he goes rook e4, what do we do here?
Okay, we can.
There's many things that we can do, but
we can return the king to g1.
Exactly, and we're not afraid of this, which looks scary, but it's really not, because we go king g2 and black cannot make progress.
Yep.
Because he cannot move his rook away from the fourth rank.
Yep.
So in any case, I just wanted to make sure you had that down. You basically know the fundamental ideas, but just wanted to make sure that you understood the method fully.
Yeah.
Because this is very important. Oftentimes, you just don't get the luxury of putting on the board the Philidor defense, and you have to know sort of the alternate.
Yeah, no, thank you, Daniel. No, Gata was it was one of his simuls, and he literally put me through the ringer for about 45 minutes at the end of the simul, and I was playing one-on-one against him.
But you managed to hold it in the end.
I saved the game, but
that's awesome.
It wasn't fun. Let me put it that way.
Playing Gata, I found is usually not fun. For some reason, I found this correlation.
Yeah, it feels like wrestling with a python.
Right. No, that's exactly what it is. Okay. So just give me 30 seconds. I need to find. I'm using a really, really good book for the next position called Mastering Endgame Strategy by an Icelandic GM who's also sort of an endgame expert. And I found a couple of really interesting endgames here that we can unpack and that I think are very instructive. So just need
thank
to.
you. Hey, Julian, my friend. It's very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. And Hazelot and hey, Chess Noob. Yeah.
Awesome. So here we go. I found it.
So I have a question for Julian. Who are you rooting for tomorrow?
All right. Copying the position and then pasting it in.
Thanks, Julian. That's very kind of you.
Here we go. So we are playing black here. This is a game of Jan Nepomniachtchi, who was playing black here against the GM. And clearly, again, black is trying to win in this position. He's got the extra pawn. He's got the king cut off on the first rank. Question is sort of how do we go about this position? How do we even think about it? And how do we plan in such positions? So what comes to mind?
Yeah, this is the type of positions that I usually get myself into trouble, as a matter of fact. Okay.
Right. It's difficult to sort of wrap your head around what's going on here because in addition to calculation, there's a lot of other skills required, such as, well, what I call long-term calculation, which I'll explain shortly. But first, I want to give you a chance to think about this position.
Okay. All right. So we have both kings are kind of cut off. White king literally, as in on the second rank, and black king is gonna be hard pressed to cross the fifth rank. Black has this weak pawn on h5.
Right.
And the thing is that white king cannot. It's best placed where it is now. And even if it weren't cut off, there is this, pawn goes to b2, and then rook is on b1. And if king moves away from the g file, there is a rook h1 resource.
Right.
The question here is, can black afford to lose this h pawn and potentially a g pawn in time to. But to do that, he needs to improve the position of the king.
Okay.
And I'm here, yeah. Anyway, so this is black to move, right, Daniel?
Right. This is black to move. That is correct.
Okay, so we're not going to achieve anything if we keep the king where it is.
Okay.
And do we gain anything by playing something along the... And obviously, white gets an infinite supply of tempo moves by playing g1, king g1 to king h1.
Right, so we're not going to induce Zug. That's an important observation. Yeah. Zugzwang is not going to play a role here. We actually need to somehow win this actively, almost.
Yes. All right, and the second consideration is, does b4 improve our case or not?
Right. So we need to start by considering b4. That is the most concrete thing that we can think about. And by thinking about it, we can inform ourselves of more of the details of this position. And then that can basically be how we latch on to some of the key concepts here.
Yeah, and if we allow that king rook to move to so it defends the pawn sideways, in other words, is rook b5 the only move for white here?
Well, here's the thing. Rook b5 is not a single move. It's sort of a defensive strategy. And if he is to play rook b5, it makes sense to consider the scenario where he takes on h5 and then plays rook b5, because going rook b5 immediately does not actually stop black from playing b3. You have to consider the worst case scenario first. So this is the crucial position that we have to evaluate. So what is going on here?
What is going on here is that we lost a pawn, basically.
We lost a pawn. What other observations can you make about the chances that black has here?
We really cannot. I mean, we cannot make any. We can make further progress by playing rook b1 and then pushing b2.
Okay.
But as long as rook stays on the b file, we have one resource here. Here we actually do have the king doesn't have any tempo moves.
That is true, but the rook does.
But the rook does, yes.
So essentially, the way you evaluate these positions, and we're going to look at a similar position next. There is one crucial litmus test for any position which has this construction, right? The rook on the first rank, the pawn on the second.
Yep.
Can we do one of two things? Can we bring our king to defend the pawn and then move the rook away? The answer is yes, but there is a problem. And this problem occurs essentially always. So let me just quickly bring the king. And the problem is white just gives a check. Yep. And as long as the king makes contact with the pawn, white gives checks. And then the moment the king removes itself from the pawn, the rook goes back to b8. This is almost never winnable unless you have some sort of way to seek shelter. And there is complexity that arises in that case, but that's rare. The second thing to realize is the only way that black can normally win is, as you say, to force the king onto f2 through some witchcraft. And if that happens, how does white win this?
Rook,
how does black win this?
Rook h1.
Rook h1, and this is a very typical idea. You win the rook.
Yeah.
The problem here is you just don't have any resources with which to force the king onto f2. There's no reason to believe that white will ever have to do that. He's just going to shuffle his rook. So that is not a valid winning strategy. In addition, you actually have a huge advantage here, which is that you're cutting off white's king on the first rank, which is huge in any rook end game.
And if you get the king on f3, you have a mating threat. Right.
So all of the signs are pointing in one direction, which is that what does black have to try to do?
Bring up the king.
Yes. So the important thing in rook end games is not to try to literally overthink it or to overcalculate. If you have a position and you have determined that there is only one serious winning attempt or one serious drawing attempt, you don't need to spend another 10 minutes thinking, oh, well, let me try to calculate this to the end. You know for a fact that this is the only attempt. Now, white has two main defensive strategies. He can do nothing, or he can try to bring his king over to the queen side. Let us first assume that white does nothing. How is black going to go about making progress?
Okay. Option one, we cannot, if white plan is play king h1, king g1 and back, we cannot obviously cross the 5th rank, so we need without getting to c6.
Right, so we need to get to c6.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the rook has to stay on the b file. If it moves away, we're going to move our rook away. Okay, now we've clearly made a lot of progress. How do we capitalize on that progress?
And now we play king d5.
All right, I'm going to try to stop you from coming to e4.
Okay, I'm going to play king c5.
Exactly. The king is a very powerful piece.
Yes, we're 4 points. Hey, Randy Chess, thank you for the follow.
All right, now what?
King d4.
Right, so I continue to do nothing, but it's clear that white's days are numbered. How do we actually win?
Well, I can play king e3 and see if I can get that, get the king to f3.
Right, and if you do, it's going to be checkmate. I mean, white has to play h3, then you take on g3, and then you deliver checkmate.
Yeah.
So that is what I call long-term calculation. You don't actually need to calculate this move by move, but you can categorize it into 2 cases. White does nothing. You can sort of forecast what you think is going to happen, because it's not like white has a million different moves. You can essentially calculate the scenario without literally calculating move by move. You can anticipate that black is going to win in that scenario by pushing his king to f3,
yep.
Which leaves white really with one strategy, which is to bring his king over to the queen side. And immediately you need to start thinking about what you might try to do there. One strategy that announces itself is to give up the b3 pawn at the right moment and then immediately turn black's attention to white's pawns when the king has abandoned them. So how do we put that into practice?
Okay.
Well, the next stage for black remains essentially forced. There's very little he can do other than this.
Okay.
What is it that we're talking about?
Well, I'm still is it beneficial for me to start executing this when king is on f1, or do I want king to go to e1?
Well, you have no choice, right? If you don't execute this, white doesn't have to go to e1. So it's like white can stand around until you execute it. So you might as well get on with it.
All right. So
I'm going to go king e1. Continue.
Okay. All right. So I'm a tempo short here. I was kind of hoping to play rook b1, push b2, and again rook h1, but that doesn't work.
But that king makes it to g2 in time. Or makes it to c2, actually.
In time, yeah. So basically here I need to... The strategy here is to take on... What is the strategy? The strategy is to take on h2.
But why do we need to do that immediately? Think about it logically. White is approaching the c file, so why don't we wait until he does that and then take on h2 so that the king is as far away as possible from the pawns? And our king perhaps can get to a superior position where it will be well prepared to then attack these pawns. So what does that all point to?
Because he can switch the position in which king stops the b2 pawn, the b pawn, and the rook basically grabs on g4.
Okay, so what move are we making here with black?
Well, good question. We'll take on h2.
Not yet. We're not doing it yet. We're waiting for white to come to d1 first.
Okay, gotcha.
But when I say waiting, I don't literally mean waiting. We also have to, there's a push and a pull effect.
Okay.
We have the push effect of white's king is approaching c1, but it's not going to approach c1 voluntarily unless we pull him towards c1 by showing our intention to make progress. And there is only one way that we have established that black can make progress, which is what? Black has only one way to make progress.
Which is king d6?
Exactly. King d1.
Okay.
Now
we need to... Now we are taking on h2.
Not yet. We are not. We are waiting for the king to come to c1. You're rushing the move rook takes h2.
Gotcha,
we can continue to make progress in the meantime.
Fair enough. Okay. So in other words, we want to play king c6.
Bingo. The rook has to drop to the b file. Now we can continue to make progress.
Okay. Now we play king d5.
Right. Now white plays king c1. Now we can make even more progress and force the king to b1, and only then do we take on h2. Exactly. Now, if the king comes to d1, then we go king c4 and we win. And the reason we win is because the rook from the c file cuts off the king. The winning plan here is not elementary, but it is very simple. We basically bring the king to b1 and then go b2. And we win that game pretty straightforwardly. That's a little bit outside of the scope of our analysis, but king b1 is therefore forced. Now, your favorite move.
Okay. And by the way, that's very straightforward. We stalemate the king, and then the white needs to play h4.
Right.
Okay. So rook h2.
Exactly. And after rook takes b3, all that remains is we need to find a way to access white's pawns, which is no trivial matter because the king is being cut off from the third rank. But there is a very typical technique that allows black to do that, which Nepo puts into practice.
Okay, we can play rook f2.
Bingo, very nice. Rook f2, king c1.
And then we can play rook f3.
Exactly. It's not hard to establish, and as we do have to establish that this pawn endgame is losing because we basically bring our king here, and now we have to make one very important move. Well, actually, we have several ways to win. Can you name one?
Okay, we can just we can play f5.
Exactly, immobilizing white's pawns, and now a very thematic plan.
King e2.
Oh yeah, now just king e2. So I meant king e1.
Okay, just play f2, and then king f3. And
stalemating white's pawns, forcing him to give it up, and now we checkmate the king.
Yeah.
There's a lot of tactics that arise from this situation in pawn ending. Sometimes this is a lot harder to assess, but keep that trick in mind. You stalemate the king, forcing the pawns to give themselves up. Okay, so for that reason, white basically has to go into desperation mode. He goes rook b7, and now Nepo plays another very patient move. He doesn't rush to take the pawn. He says, I can first defend my pawns, and I can just win g3, and that way I don't have to go for anything adventurous. This actually is not very clear. So how do we defend the pawn?
We can even afford to play king e6.
That's exactly what he does. Rook b6 check. Now Nepo basically walks his king over king f5, rook b5, king e4, rook e5, king d4. He has king d3. He has maximally improved the position of his king. Rook f5, and now what do? Final stage of the game.
Final stage of the game, we take the pawn.
He takes ours.
Okay, we play. What do we play? We play king e4.
We can do that. He plays rook f3, so he paves the way for the pawn. There's many moves that win.
Okay.
F5, g3, rook g7, and now the final move of the game, after which white resigned. Try to spot it.
Okay. It's... hold on. It's actually a little tricky.
Yeah, definitely some calculation is required here.
Okay, we cannot play king e4 because she's gonna push f6.
F6, right, where that would be the wrong way.
We need to play king c3.
Right. Well, still going the wrong way. You're allowing white's king to approach the pawn.
Ah, okay.
So you need to assign roles here, right? The rook right now it's too busy. It's both protecting the stopping white's pawn and protecting black's pawn. The king has to join in on the party here.
All right, so we need to plan. Yeah, okay, I understood. You play king e3.
Or king e2.
King e2.
F6.
Then we play king f2.
Yep, and the game is over. F7.
And g2.
Yep, that's exactly right. And that's it. We just promote the pawn and then take white's pawn. So.
Okay.
This might seem outwardly like a very complicated game. It's a long winning process, but it can be divided very clearly into stages.
Yep.
And notice that you always have to sort of consider the concrete move first. Notice that if you tried to save the pawn, white would have given a check and then dropped his rook back. And this actually doesn't give black anything. Rook f5. And black actually has made negative progress because giving up the f pawn is clearly inferior to giving up the h pawn. because giving up the f pawn allows white to create his own passer.
Okay.
So stage one was to bring the pawn to b3. That's actually a very typical idea. You bring the pawn to the third rank, and the third rank is kind of magical in Rook End Games because it's far enough to where a rook that stands behind the pawn on the third rank is sort of tied down to it, but it's not too far to where it's counterproductive and it ties down our own rook. So remember the notion of keeping the passed pawn on the third rank and then approaching the king and dislodging your opponent's rook from a crucial square. And that's basically the whole winning strategy. Okay, let's take a look at one or two more examples, which I think are pretty instructive.
Yep.
Let me just set up the next one. And the next one is a little bit more tactical in nature, but it is very similar in the sense that you perform long-term calculation. You develop a target position that you try to aim for, and that is the only way to sort of make heads or tails of an otherwise very complicated position. Here we go. Now, you're playing white here, and you're trying to win. You can see some similarities between this position and the previous one. White's got that pawn on the 6th rank, but the situation is very different. Black's king is very active this time, and we've got different properties of the position. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, I am familiar with this position, and a7 should be winning immediately.
Okay,
right?
so a7 basically not immediately, because black is just basically waits on the a file. How do you actually win this?
Okay, I need to make a progress. I need to somehow make. Okay, I need to force the black king away to either go into e file or g file,
or more broadly on a checkable square.
A checkable square, yes.
Right.
All right. So basically, I need to play f3 here.
Yep, that's exactly right. We start with a breakthrough. Well, black, he can stave off taking, but he eventually has to take. Okay.
Okay, now I take on f3.
Right. So what are you threatening here? If black just waits, what are you going to do?
I'm going to give a check on e4.
And this achieves the desired objective.
Yes. Yep.
Rook g8. So black can actually defend resiliently here. I give you a check on f1. You go king e2, and I go rook a1.
Okay, fair enough.
Here, go ahead.
I need to figure out how to make progress here, right?
Exactly, because the idea of this is if you go e4 now, I'm not going to take the pawn because that allows rook e8. I'm going to go king f4. And black tries to carve out these crucial escape squares for his king.
Okay, and dumb question. Let's assume I play, just for being a devil's advocate.
No worries.
I play e4.
Okay, I go king f4.
And I play e5.
Far from a dumb question, that's actually the solution. So you sacrifice the pawn in order to create that potential for a checkable square. Very nice. It's simple, but it's very nice. F takes e5.
And rook f8 wins.
Rook f8 check, and then a8 queen. And if king takes e5, you give another check. And if I go f5?
I'm gonna do the best Yasser impersonation and say push him baby and play e6.
Push him baby, e6, yes. And white, black achieves the objective of not allowing white to check him, but he goes from the frying pan into the fire. Now the pawn promotes. Exactly. So that's the correct strategy. And this concept is actually at the heart of one of the most important concepts in Rook End Games in general, which is this notion of getting the king onto a checkable square of one kind or another, and it can be applied in many different types of positions. Here's another very simple example where I was actually able to use this particular type of technique and come up with a winning plan in a position that would otherwise be a little bit hard to fully understand. So here we have a position where white is up 2 pawns, which seems very overwhelming. But again, we have the situation with the rook tied down to the pawn. And these are not always winning. In fact, if you were to remove all the pawns from the board and just keep the h pawn, it is a draw. H and g pawns are a draw because you cannot force the king onto f7. But here we have a 3-on-2. How does white use this to his advantage?
Okay, again, we need to get black king onto the checkable square.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, we kind of we want to try to bring the king up.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
so one way to make progress is to push f3 first.
Okay, so you want to push f3 first.
Yeah.
Rook, let's say I do nothing.
Okay, I'm gonna go king g3.
Okay, I'm obviously doing nothing.
Okay, so here is the thing. What's the best way for me to get you on a checkable square? Okay, I'm gonna play h4.
Okay.
Which actually, hold on a second. I'm just trying to figure out what is my best way of getting you into a checkable square.
Right. Because remember that if you bring your king to c7, for example, I'm going to check it. That strategy almost never works.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you actually don't need to use your king. I'll give you a hint. You do not need to use your king at all in this whole process.
Yeah, that's the thought just occurred to me. And I can't really force my king onto f8 because at some point you're going to play king g7. And
exactly. That's an issue, right?
All right, so let's... but I still need to... All right, so basically... I need to get a check on g6 with the pawn.
Right.
And then if you take it, it's rook g8. And if you don't take it, I'm going to push f6.
Right.
All right, so I'm going to play h4.
That's a good start. Again, black can make a million different moves along the b file, but for the sake of simplicity, let's say I just toggle between b5 and b6.
Okay, I prefer you to be here on, so I'm gonna just, let me play f4.
Okay, I wait.
Okay, g5.
So, again, a couple of things I can do. Let's say I take on g5. That's the trickiest move, actually.
Okay. All right, so it's which... Okay, now which pawn do I take it with?
Right, that's the key question. Because one of these moves, I believe, both probably win, but one allows white to maintain the purity. Well, actually, I didn't really mean to play this. This actually forces white to demonstrate a different winning strategy, but this is also very instructive. So let's first say he takes.
All right, so I bet you that other strategy is to take with an f pawn. Right,
but no, actually, so I need to think about this myself for a second. So here. No. This, it's all good. White maintains the main winning strategy. You take with the h pawn.
Yeah.
And it took me a second to actually realize that, because this is actually a really cool idea that it takes a moment to wrap your head around. Okay, well, let's say I go rook b4.
Okay. All right, so you know what? I'm not going to move any pawns. So I'm just going to play f5.
Good call. I'm going to move my rook. And I can start checking you, but the king will easily escape the checks.
I'll go on h5.
Yeah, or you can go to whatever. You can zigzag your way toward the rook.
Yeah. All right, so here g6 should be winning.
And that is true. g6 check. If king g7.
I'm going to just take on f7.
And now you're going to go rook h8.
Yeah.
And if I take on g6, and this is the pivotal concept.
I do f6.
Right. Taking would actually be a draw. King g7. This is a theoretical draw. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
You cannot make any more progress. And that is why it's very important to be careful in these positions. Mm-hmm. My opponent played h5. But here, it's basically the same thing. I actually started with f6 just to be cool. And now I went g6. It just kind of produces a nice aesthetic effect, but g6 wins as well.
Yeah.
You resign because after fg, there is f7, and it's the same exact deal. King g6 or king h6, whatever, okay, h8. So very simple, but a lot of games have been won through varieties of this plan, the pawn breakthrough to get the king onto a checkable square.
Okay.
And that is a crucial concept to conceptualize. And if you are deciding whether to put your pawn on the 7th rank and support it with a rook, you have to keep in mind whether you think that you will be able to accomplish that. Otherwise, it might be worth keeping the pawn on the 6th rank, and then you can actually bring your king over and you can hide behind the pawn.
Yep.
So I know that's kind of a lot of concepts. They're general, but hopefully this gives you a little bit more guidelines as to how to approach certain positions.
Yes, no, definitely.
And what do you say we finish with one more sort of classical position, which demonstrates a couple of other very important themes?
Sounds like a plan.
And this is a game that I particularly enjoy for the reason that, well, first of all, because of who played it, and I personally really respect this player. And second of all, it really is a brilliant illustration of the importance of remaining active in these endgames. Piece activity is the single most important concept in the endgame. It far supersedes in many ways material. Of course, material is important, but king activity and rook activity often is worth many pawns, 3 pawns sometimes. And this game reveals that. It is a game between Josero Capablanca, world champion, and Sabeli Tartakower, who was no fish himself. I mean, he was a very strong player. He was also sort of a chess comedian. He coined a lot of very famous little quips. And they are playing in 1924 at a very illustrious tournament, the New York International. So Capablanca is white in this position.
I have here unfortunate disadvantage that I know this
You've
position.
seen it. You know this position.
Yes.
So what is the move? What is the idea?
The winning move is to play king g3.
Exactly.
And then king
so you
a,
basically swing the king around. Yeah. And the key to this position is you basically sack all of your pawns. But at the end of the day, the king appears on f6, and the g6 pawn is what wins the game for white. So that's a very simple illustration of that concept. Fortunately, I have a backup game in mind. I'm glad you actually have seen this. So you've been modest. You actually have put in quite a bit of work into Rook End Games, as I can see. Your instincts are really good. So I don't think you have anything to fear inherently.
No, my problem is that, I know it's getting it all together is
right,
and especially when there is not enough time is I got swindled out of quite a lot of won positions because I have 10 seconds and I mess up a Rook End game. So
right. No, that totally makes sense, and I have as well. So let me just find, again, I've lost my place. Let me just find the position I wanted to show you, and then we will proceed to discuss it and perhaps make some sort of general conclusions that might help you. Okay, this is it. Now, this is another classical game. This one I don't think you've seen because it's a little bit less well-known than the Capablanca game. But the players who were playing it are no less famous. Emanuel Lasker against Akiba Rubinstein. Akiba Rubinstein is considered one of the fathers of modern sort of endgame play, but here he was on the losing side against a very capable opponent, Emanuel Lasker. So I really enjoy these classical games because they can really illustrate in a very clear manner certain themes that you can take to heart, basically. Okay, so let me just make sure my chess space is frozen for some reason. Just close it and reopen it. Okay. And
yeah, ChessBase actually has a couple of memory leaks in their code.
Interesting. So that is that behind some of the glitches?
Yes. If you keep ChessBase running for a long period of time. Sadly, I'm actually even familiar with this position, but that's fine.
This one too?
Yes.
Wow, that's really cool. What is the idea?
The idea here is basically you start by Rook F4 by cutting away any kind
very,
of
very nice.
play.
No, that's I'm actually happy to hear that you've seen it.
Yes. Yeah, that's
is the third time going to be the charm? That's the key question.
I have a lot.
I think it will be.
Oh, sure. Dr. Lono just sent me a note that the board is not showing in your stream.
Oh, sorry. Not seeing the board. Yeah. My bad. Oh, crap.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lono. of course.
Okay. Oh yeah, that glitch just happened. So people were seeing the previous game. That's good.
And Dr. Only incidentally is a dear friend of mine, so if he doesn't mind, I'm gonna make him a mod in my channel.
Absolutely.
I would give him a VIP badge, but I'm freshly out of VIP slot. So, but thank you for carrying the swords for me, Dr. Lono. That's very greatly appreciated.
Yeah, the gratitude is reciprocated on my end. Okay, so Van Beek against Michelson. Van Weyligiri is what we're gonna. Yeah, so okay.
I have a lacuna of about 25 years from about 1989 until 2014. So I'm highly likely not to be familiar with a game that happened in that period. Okay, that I'm not familiar with this.
Okay, now let me just refresh my own board because it stopped showing. There we go. So this position, yeah. So this comes from 2008. It's not a very famous game, but it brings together a couple of the concepts that we've discussed basically from the start. So it's white to move. Clearly, white is trying to win here. There's no doubt about that. How does white go about this position?
Okay. So you have a dominant rook on the 7th rank. You have this pawn at h7. That's a little bit problematic. White appears that this was a pawn endgame that white might be winning, but I'm not that 100% sure. I would need to calculate that. So the question here is, how does white make any progress in this position?
Right, exactly. Once again, it's a familiar problem in Rook End Games.
Yeah. All right. Okay, rook h7, rook g5 doesn't achieve anything. All right, so...
Right.
Yeah. Thank you, Hypothesis GG. That's very greatly appreciated. Thank you. All right. All right. So what we probably want to do is here is a thought. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually gonna talk myself through this.
Sure.
This black rook is very well placed.
Yes.
So we kind of want to get it out of there.
Absolutely.
That's number one. Number two, and we can do it with a tempo. Number two, the pawn on g5 is very well advanced, and basically, if we manage to protect it, but in other words, we can sacrifice a pawn on 2 on the other side to promote that pawn on g5.
Right.
So I'm gonna play king d4.
Good start.
With an idea that after you give me a check on d5, I'm gonna go to e4.
Yeah, you've basically done all the hard work. Now black is in trouble. If he continues, just to illustrate the waiting strategy, as you've said, you go king f4.
Yes.
And if black goes around to take the pawns, it's very easy to establish that black is not even close. You just play g7 and you promote.
Yeah.
So in the game, black tries the far more resilient rook to d7, which brings us to the first principle that we started with.
Yeah. Which is activity. Or, well...
Well, I mean, it's the first sort of principle, which is that you always have to kind of keep an eye on the possibility of liquidation.
Yep.
In any kind of situation.
All right. So
and whether it's good.
Okay. In other words, the question here is white winning the pawn endgame?
Yes.
All right. So we take king d7. We do not want to give All right, so we obviously don't want to play king e5 because then gives black the opposition. So we're going to play king f5.
So I'll caution you a little bit about opposition. People sometimes overestimate the importance of opposition. Opposition is important only in certain positions.
Okay.
And when a pawn endgame is reached, the position has transformed itself. You sort of want to take stock of, again, what the long-term plan here might be. What are White's advantages here other than his king placement? Because that actually might guide you toward a more convincing winning strategy.
Yeah, no, it's the question of I mean, the pawn on g5 is well advanced, and pawns on c6 and a5 are weak.
And what does weak mean in the context of this endgame? Does White actually have any actionable ways potentially to exploit either of those?
That's a good question.
And think about that very carefully, because that is the key to approaching this position correctly.
Okay. Well, not in a sense, not immediately, right?
So true, but he has an idea that can allow him to exploit one of those pawns.
Okay. And second, there is also a possibility of a pawn breakthroughs, right? Because there is this b4 option.
Correct. There is the option of playing b4. Yes. Certainly. Now, can we prepare that option? Can we prepare that move?
Well, the king is in the square.
Right.
So yeah. So we have lost the game. So we need to get the black king away from the square.
Not necessarily. You're assuming that you have to sacrifice on b4. And you're forgetting that you can actually prepare the pawn break b4 without it being a sacrifice.
Okay.
And then we're going to have a situation with an outside passed pawn.
No, I hear you. Yep, yep. Okay. So let's assume so I don't think I can actually capture this pawn effectively. So what I need to do is I need to convert the position in which okay, yeah, I hear you. That's actually very instructive pawn endgame. I need to play king d4.
Exactly.
Yep.
So black goes king d6.
Okay, now we're gonna play king c4.
Right, and here there's a big problem, because if black goes c5, now you're right, he introduces a weakness. How do we exploit it?
Well, there is only one move we can play, which is king b5.
And we take the pawn and we win. So black must dip his king back to d7.
Yep. And now what we want to do is, can we triangulate here so so it doesn't have... Well,
we don't need to.
We don't need to.
We don't need to.
We can play king c5.
We don't even need to do that.
Well, we can then play b4.
Why do we need to go king c5 first? That's actually counterproductive because it sends the king a little bit closer to the pawn.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
So here, the rules in pawn endgames are different than the rules in like middle games. And that's why people can struggle. Sure. You have to keep an eye on what it is exactly that you're trying to do. Here, you're saying, I'm trying to create an outside pass pawn, okay?
Yeah.
So it's important for the king to be as far away from that pass pawn as possible. Boom, that's it. We don't want the king to be on c7. We want it to be on d7. As it turns out, even if the king were on c7, this would probably be winning, although it would be very close. Here, how do we actually now win this position?
Okay, we play king c5.
Okay, king b7.
And let's see here. We have to play a5.
Right, so if king c7, then a6 is winning. So king a6 is forced. Now we enter the race, the king race phase. That's not particularly hard to calculate. No. Who wins that race?
We win by one tempo.
We win by one tempo. So let me just demonstrate that for the benefit of the audience here. And this is just pure calculation, and we win by one tempo. If the king were on e6 here, black would go king f5 and draw. Yep. As it stands, he is not able to draw. So white wins.
Yeah.
So again, we can see the breakdown of the stages here. First, we realize that our big chance is to win that h7 pawn by bringing our king over to the g5 pawn. And then we don't forget that we automatically have to evaluate every pawn endgame that occurs on the board that's possible. every liquidation. Joel Benjamin even has a book on that called Liquidation in Chess, where he literally talks about how to evaluate transitions into pawn endgames, because those can be difficult. And once we transition into the pawn endgame, we appraise ourselves of all of the possible ideas before we actually look at concrete moves, because that can actually mislead us into thinking that something that looks impressive, such as king f5, is the move, when in fact, if we start by thinking about the plans, we realize that king takes king d4, while this looks less impressive, is actually a lot more effective.
Agreed. No, that's actually the most instructive part of this endgame.
Right, the king d4, king c4, b4.
The king t4, that basically the solution is to not go after the h7 pawn, but to go there to create a distant passed pawn on the other.
Exactly, the outside passed pawn is one of the most important plans in any pawn endgame. The creation of an outside passed pawn is a very powerful thing. Okay. So to summarize, then, we talked about liquidation into the pawn endgame and always assessing that. We talked about the importance of activity. Situations where we have a passed pawn that's supported from a rook in front of it, where you bring the pawn to the 6th rank, evaluate the situation, and if you can find a way to get the king on a checkable square, you can bring the pawn all the way to the 7th rank. But that's a very committal thing, because then the rook is going to be paralyzed. So really, in Rook End Games, everything is concretely based, and we have to break things down into long-term calculations. So sometimes we cannot calculate 30 moves ahead. We have to sort of forecast how the situation is going to look in, let's say, 10 moves. If you have a particular plan, you can almost make the assumption that that plan succeeds, and you can break down your opponent's responses into sort of categories. Like, there is a category where your opponent does nothing. Okay, that's one. Then there's a category where your opponent mounts some sort of active resistance, and that can allow you to break things down a lot more effectively than if you were just trying to calculate, and quickly, than if you were just trying to calculate variation through brute force.
Yep.
So how does that all sound? Do you have any sort of questions?
No, as you, Danya, and both chats could see, I am actually reasonably familiar with quite a few theoretical positions. Where I get into trouble is when it comes, which is exactly the liquidation part of the whole thing,
right?
Conversion of a transition into one of those winning positions that I'm familiar with. Mm-hmm. And let me put it this way: if this were an actual game and I had 10 seconds on the clock, there is no way. I mean, before this, that I'm playing King D4 as a winner.
Well, I mean, with 10 seconds, even I probably wouldn't play King D4. So don't temper your expectations with with little time on the clock. But with increment, which we'll have tomorrow, hopefully that gives you a little bit more breathing room.
Sure.
A little bit more leeway as to finding the correct winning plan should an endgame be reached. All right. Well, I think it's probably a good place for us to pause for today.
Okay. Thank you, Danya. Very greatly appreciated.
It's been a pleasure, Nikola. I hope you've benefited from the sessions, and I'm happy to continue this even after your match.
Thank you. I will be happy to.
That sounds great. I'll be cheering for you tomorrow. So tomorrow, 12 Eastern, is that correct? Against Grandmaster Anna Muzychuk. Nikola will be playing an adoption match. Hopefully, we will put you will put some of these opening analyses to use.
Yep.
And I'll definitely be watching and cheering you on, Nikola.
Thank you. Are you going to continue to stream?
Yeah, I'll go for a little bit longer.
Okay. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to send my chat. Thank you, Queen. That's very greatly appreciated. Thank you, Worship, my dear friend. Congratulations on, thank you for accepting your modship, Dr. Lono. And I'm sending my chat to Danya. Wish me luck tomorrow. I have, proverbial snowflake in hell comes into mind, but I'll die with my boots on. Thank you, Fent777. That's very greatly appreciated. Thank you. And we are going to send the raid to Danya.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nikola. Have a great night and good luck tomorrow.
Yep. I'll need it.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Very good. Okay. Very nice. Raid is going. Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon. See you tomorrow. Wish me luck.